Hey, I'm Scott from Stringjoy. I'm out in a cabin in the woods outside of Nashville, and if you're anything like me and you watch a lot of scary movies or horror movies, you think of a cabin in the woods and you think of dead people. Well, today, we're not talking about dead people, but we're talking about dead strings. If you've played guitar for long, you've probably had a string that, after a few months of use or different buildup, or you just sweat a whole lot on it, it just starts to sound not right. It kind of has a thuddy tone to it. It doesn't sustain very well. It starts to intonate badly. That, my friends, is a dead string, and today, out here, we're going to talk all about it. The term dead gets thrown around a lot when it comes to guitar strings. It can mean a lot of different things to different people, and I think some people probably misuse it. For example, I've seen on forums people talking about certain brands of pure nickel strings or things like that, and saying, they were just dead right out of the pack. But that's not really fair. Those strings are pure nickel. They have less output and much more of a bass-heavy sound. So, I don't think that's really fair in that case. It wasn't anything that changed with the string. In that case, you're just hearing the sound of a different alloy. But in contrast to that, deadness is something that happens to strings over time. The symptoms of a string going dead are that it's lacking in sustain, it's lacking in tonal richness, and what I mean by that is there's not nearly as many overtones to the sound. It's much more just like the center note that you're trying to hit. And also some intonation problems can develop once a string goes dead as well. Now, depending on the string and the circumstance and the player and all of that, a dead string might not exhibit all of those properties. It might just exhibit one or two of those properties. But in general, the things that all of those different properties have in common is that for whatever reason, a guitar string isn't resonating properly. Now, when it comes to strings that are actually dead, so it's the string itself, you've ruled out anything on a setup side or anything like that, there's a couple different ways that can happen, and we're going to talk about them a little bit in depth here. One that I want to get out of the way right from the beginning, because it's a little bit different than the others, is simply that there's a bunch of crud built up on the string. Crud, or sweat or dirt, things from your hands, that can dampen the strings in general. So if you have a bunch of it built up in the windings of a string, that's going to cause that string to not really resonate the way that it wants to, and that can lead to all of those issues. So that's a really simple one. It's an easy fix. It's usually just cleaning your strings or putting on a new set of strings, but it differs a little bit from some of the other examples that we're going to talk about that'll get a little bit more into the physics of what's happening. So with the exception of crud buildup aside, generally when strings do die, what's actually happening is that the core wire on the inside of the string is losing its elasticity for a number of different reasons that we're going to talk about here. So on your plain strings, there's nothing but core wire, so it could be, any of that wire. On your wound strings, if you're new to this channel or don't know all that much about guitar strings, that winding that you see on the outside, those little ridges, is a wire that's wrapped around another wire, which we call the core wire. So in general, when it comes to dead strings, it's not usually an issue with the wrap wire, unless it's that crud buildup. It's actually an issue at the very, very heart of the string, down at the core wire, where something is happening that's causing that core wire to lose its elasticity and not resonate the way that it should. We're going to get into a couple of different causes of that loss of elasticity, but first let's talk about what a string should be doing in theory, what a perfect string should be doing. Basically, in a perfect string, you have complete uniformity all the way down. When physicists will model strings, they'll usually look at like an ideal material that's exactly the same all the way through over the entire length of the string. It's not any thicker or thinner at any different point, and that ideal string is going to resonate perfectly every time. But in the real world, that's not exactly how strings actually work. See, wire is drawn to different tolerances, and it depends on where you get your wire or how your wire is made, what tolerance it's being drawn to, but in general, wire that might be, 10 thousandths of an inch, what we would call a 10 in guitar land, might vary anywhere from, 10.1 or 10.2 down to 9.8. Some of it will vary even wider, though most string companies like ours will grade it on the way in so that we're not getting stuff that varies out too widely. But the point here really is that wire is always going to vary ever so slightly. No matter how tight you get it, there's going to be some variation. And there's a point at which some of that variation is okay and doesn't cause any issues, and there's a point at which it becomes too much and can cause issues like a dead sounding string. Now, while string companies like ours do our best to ensure that any string that's being sent out new doesn't exhibit any of these big issues that can cause inconsistencies in the length of the string and cause things to not play right, we think that we do a really, really great job of that, so I wouldn't assume that that's something that's coming that way. Strings can actually change over the course of their wear, which is what we're going to talk about. So the first issue that causes dead strings like we're talking about is that the core wire itself has fatigued with wear. So fatigue refers to cyclic loading without going too deep into the physics of it, the easiest way to imagine it, I think, is if you think about a paperclip. So there's a point that you can apply enough force to a paperclip to just snap it right in two, right? But even if you're not applying that level of force to the paperclip, you can still break it. And the way that you do it is by wiggling the paperclip ever so slightly. You're never exceeding the force that you would need to break it. But over time, you cause fatigue in the paperclip, and it'll just come undone really quickly. Now with fatigue, what's happening at a molecular level is that you're forming microfractures and micro cracks in the material itself, which initially on their own aren't enough to cause that material to break, but over time, as you put more load on the material and create more fatigue, you'll eventually have something break. Now when it comes to dead strings, it doesn't have to actually break entirely for fatigue to cause it to not resonate properly. If you build up enough of those micro cracks, even if you haven't gotten to the point that a string is going to just snap on you, it can still not resonate properly the way that it would, because again, you're creating more unevenness in the material. The second issue, which is what I think a lot of players think about when they think of dead strings, is that the core wire itself has corroded, causing again these same sort of microfractures or cracks in the material itself. This is actually something a lot of players I don't think are that familiar with. When it comes to wound strings on your guitar, tarnish or discoloration or things like that on the outside of the strings, so long as it's not, a bunch of gunk that's literally building up on the string, actually doesn't cause that much of an issue with the string. The thing that's resonating itself is that core wire down at the center of the string. So if that's okay, even if some tarnish is present on the outside of the string, it's not going to affect how that string is actually resonating. But if that, tarnish or whatever caused tarnish on the wrap wire gets down to the core wire itself, it can cause corrosion, which will cause a string to sound dead or eventually break. Now, different companies have different approaches to preventing this. Obviously, coated companies will coat the core and the wrap and sometimes just the outside of the string entirely to help ensure that no sweat or debris or anything like that is getting down to the core wire, which can cause this sort of corrosion and cause your string to sound dead. Now, the trouble with coatings is that while they'll indeed prevent that corrosion at the core wire, they are themselves kind of the same thing that we were talking about earlier when you get so much gunk built up in the outside of your string that it stops them from resonating properly. Coated strings come that way. So while you're fighting one type of corrosion or one type of thing that can cause a dead string, you're doing it at the risk of causing a string that's dead right from the beginning because it already has things inhibiting the way that it'll resonate. At Stringjoy, we actually take a little bit of a different approach to this. Basically, when you get a set of guitar strings from one of the big guys, even though you can't see it, there's a little bit of space between every winding on that string. They do this for different reasons. It can cause a very lively string, but a string that dies fast. And they kind of prefer that, depending on who you'd ask, they'd have a different reason for why they do it. For us, we don't really do that. We wrap ours a lot tighter. The wrap wires are very, very close together. Ideally, they're completely touching. And this does the same thing that coatings kind of do to a certain degree of stopping as much moisture or gunk getting down from the core, but they do it without causing big issues when it comes to resonance or things like that, like coated strings will. Another issue that can cause strings to go dead is what we call local deformation. So in this case, a string is getting changed at one particular area or multiple different areas along its length, causing it to be uneven. The best example I could think of for this is if you ever look at a string of yours under a microscope, or if you've had them on your guitar for a really long time, they might look like this even to the naked eye. But at places where they contact the frets, you can see either little divots or bends in the string. This can either be because the core wire is bending a little bit around those frets over time, especially if you're playing jumbo frets or fretting really hard. It can also simply be that the wrap wire or a different area of the string has worn off a little bit against the frets over time. As you can imagine, as this becomes more and more severe over the course of a string's lifetime, it's going to cause the string to become even more uneven. That will cause it to not resonate properly and, of course, sound very dead. Now, the final thing that can cause a string to be dead is one that I find actually the most interesting. This is actually something that can cause a string to die straight out of the pack. And that's that the string itself was made with too heavy of a core wire. We've tested this ourselves on different gauges of strings. You can always make up a string with a different recipe in terms of how thick the core wire should be and how thick the wrap wire should be to arrive at a string that has the same ultimate diameter. But we've found that if you have too thick of a core wire on a certain string, that string just won't resonate right from the get-go and it'll sound dead. This is especially an issue when it comes to like low E's on acoustic guitars. For example, we make our 56s with a 19 core and a 19 wrap. If you multiply 19 by 3, you get 57, and we compress them slightly to make them a 56. I talk about this a little bit more in depth in other videos. But if you were to make that same 56 with something like a 20 core or a 21 core, you could get it to also be a 56, but it wouldn't resonate the same way. And once you put it on your guitar right from the get-go, you would feel that it didn't have much sustain, it didn't have many overtones, and it's all for the same ultimate reasons, being that that core just isn't going to resonate quite as well as it should. Even though it hasn't deformed or had any issues like that we talked about before, it just won't resonate because it's just too darn big. So I brought this telly here with me because it's got actually not our strings, I swear. I had it off with a tech for a little while, and he did a pretty good job, but since he dropped it back off at my shop, the humidity is very, very different there than when he set it up, so it's morphed a little bit. Some of the strings have gone dead in different ways, and I wanted to talk about it really briefly. So a good example would be this high E string. I'll play it through the amp too, though it's a little bit harder to hear. It doesn't have a lot of the sustain that it ought to, right? But in this case, this is actually a setup thing. I believe it's an issue at the nut, but I haven't taken it apart to check in and look. But that's not exactly how a string will die. Typically, plain strings don't really die in that same way because they're a lot more homogeneous from the get-go, whereas wound strings are much more heterogeneous. But this low E, especially if you hear it without the amp on, it doesn't have quite as much sustain as it ought to. Now I'm going to actually take this string apart later on today to see if it's an issue with like the size of the core, or it's more what I'm thinking where it's just kind of lost a little bit of its elasticity over time, since these have been on the guitar for a few months. But you know, even with me, I discover dead strings here and there. I don't find them too much with our strings, hopefully, but it can absolutely happen. And if you keep a set of strings on a guitar for long enough, they're eventually going to die. So my question for all of you out there today is, what's the longest you've ever had a set of strings on your guitar? It might be the first guitar you ever had, maybe you never changed the strings on it for the first 3 years of playing, or maybe it's a guitar that you have down in the basement right now. But I'm curious, for me, I would say it's probably been, if it's bass, it's been at least 6 years since I've changed strings on one of my basses. If it's guitar itself, probably about 15 months has been the longest on a guitar that I've played consistently. Right now, my Jazzmaster I have at home, that's my number one, has had the same strings on it for 9 months, and they still sound pretty good. But I'm curious what you guys' experience with it has been. Let us know down in the comments.